convinced. Right? So judgment relates two concepts, and what does it do? It either affirms it or denies. So judgment can either be true or false. A question will not be true or false. An exclamation is not true or false. But it has to be a declarative sentence in order to be true or false. So someone might say, we are alive. Another person says, no, that's illusion. We can either confirm this or negate it. Now, this judgment has to be referred back to a reference point so that we can know if it's true or false. So what will make us say that a judgment is true, a sentence is true, or another is false? We have to refer back to something, isn't it? There has to be a standard that we can judge things on. Whether that thing is our senses or something else. But before we actually go into this, when we judge, we affirm. What do we affirm? We might affirm an existential thing, an existential meaning to an existent individual or an existent entity. So for example, I might say, the table is blue. Blue is a meaning, isn't it? And it's an existential meaning. What do I mean by an existential meaning? It has a reality outside. That's the meaning. That's the meaning of existential. It has a reality outside. Things can have reality in the mind, reality in language, and reality outside. So when I say blue, I imagine something, isn't it? I imagine a color. And then it has an existence outside, or a representation outside. Plato talks about ideas. And he says, that's kind of very primitive philosophy. So Plato says that ideas exist separate from the mind, and then they exist in the mind. What does the mind do? It relates, it sees the idea, the essence, in things regardless. So if you see different circles of different sizes, different colors, different places, why do you look at all of these representations and still say this is a circle? There is an idea of a circle in your mind, an essence of a circle in your mind, isn't it? That made you, your mind, human mind, what did it do? It just picked up that idea. It was able to recognize the circle regardless of the size, regardless of the color, regardless of any other thing. It might be drawn on plastic, it might be drawn on the wall, it might be drawn on paper, and you still say it's a circle. So an existential meaning is a meaning that exists in reality, as opposed to privative meaning. Privative meaning is a word that does not have a reality in itself. Its job is to negate the opposite. So for example, when I say, this is beginningless, meaning it's without a beginning. There is nothing out there in existence that's called beginninglessness. It's a privative meaning, right? It's a privative meaning, which means that no one can bring out something to me and say, this is beginninglessness. But someone can bring something and say, blue. So blue has an existential meaning, but beginninglessness is a privative meaning. So anyway, we would normally affirm an existential meaning to existent being, like when we affirm knowledge to God and we say God is all-knowing. So knowledge has a reality, right? Whether it's limited knowledge as human knowledge or absolute knowledge like the knowledge of God. Or we can confirm a privative meaning to a non-existent, i.e. an absurd being, like a second God. We'll talk about that much later. a second God. We believe that the existence of a second God is absurdity. It's impossible. So when we relate to that second God, we say, it's absurd. I made a judgment. I said, it's impossible to have a second God. Why? Very simply, the existence of two entities means that there is difference between them. There has to be difference between them. Why? Why would we need another entity? And if there is difference between them, that means one of them is lower or higher than the other. And if one of them is lower than the other, then he cannot be God. So when we say privative to existent, to non-existent, when we say a second God is impossibility. Having a second God is impossibility. We have now affirmed a meaning, a privative meaning, because absurd means what? No one can tell me, oh, look, this is absurdity. It's a privative meaning. It does not have an existential reality. Or we might be affirming a privative to existent. A privative to existent, like beginninglessness, eternity. When we say God is eternal, God has an existent reality. But eternality or beginninglessness, it doesn't have an existence on its own. It's just a privative meaning. We might also be, as I said before, judgment is to affirm something to something or to deny something from something. We might be denying an existential to an existent. Ignorance. Ignorance has an existent reality. Ignorance doesn't mean the absence of knowledge. Why? Because you might, for example, if someone believes that the weather is hot, and we say, you're ignorant. It's actually cold. So does he have an entity, an existential entity, an existential meaning, something out there that's called ignorance? Yes. So ignorance is not just a negation of knowledge. It's not the absence of knowledge. It could be the existence of wrong knowledge. So ignorance is wrong knowledge. That's why we need to clear it first. Socrates developed a philosophy that's called heuristic philosophy. Through the heuristic philosophy, he used to follow two methods in order to prove something. First, he used to follow something called the ironic method. So through the ironic method, he will ask one of his students a question, and the student claims that he knows the answer. So he says, what's virtue, for example? Or what's existence? Or what is goodness? And his student says, goodness is such and such. It's a wrong answer. So Socrates wouldn't say this is a wrong answer. He will start asking more questions. Like when you iron something, he starts asking more very witty questions until the person recognizes and confesses that I don't know. Once he reaches that point, that means he has neutralized all his previous biases and removed and cleared all his ignorance. Then Socrates will move to the second step, which is explaining and finding. So an existential to existent. When we say ignorance and Allah, we deny that. We say Allah is not ignorant. That's a denial of what? That's a denial of a meaning to an existent entity. Or it might be a privative to existent, like contingency. What's contingency? Contingency means createdness. Contingency means createdness. That's a privative meaning. Why is it a privative meaning? Because as I said before, beginninglessness is not an existential meaning. It's a privative. It says you have no beginning. When we say something is contingent, it means it's not eternal. So the job of these two words, contingency and eternality, is not to have an existence in themselves, but just to remove the opposite. So when I say, for example, human beings are created, or human beings are contingent, the contingency of human beings means it doesn't have an existence in itself. It just means that we are not eternal. We have not existed forever. And when I say God is eternal, it just means it doesn't have an existence in itself. It just means that he's beyond time. It means time does not affect him. So a privative meaning to an existence, we deny contingency to God. We say God is not contingent. God does not exist within time. God is beyond time. Or a privative to non-existent. So for example, when we negate eternality from a second God. Now these three scenarios of affirmation and the three scenarios of denial are the scenarios of judgment. So we affirm something to something, or we deny something from something. We look at two entities, whether one is privative or existential, or the other is existent or non-existent, and then we move them around, right? Now, what do we judge based on? So we spoke so far about two things, about what is a judgment and what question does a judgment answer, and what is the content of a judgment? It's a proposition. And what are the scenarios that we would look around and affirm something to something, or so judgment in language, judgment generally is to affirm something to something or to deny something from another thing. Whether that is based on rationality, or based on society, or based on anything else. Now, the reference point gives us different categories of judgments. So the criterion, what is the criterion based on which I have made this judgment? The criterion is the hakim. If you speak, for example, to a non-Muslim and say prayer is an obligation, he will say, no, it's not an obligation for me. Why? Because he does not accept that hakim. He does not accept that criterion. That criterion doesn't apply to him or her. It applies to Muslims only. So this circle, this jurisdiction, this work of this hakim, which is Sharia, law, legal system, applies only in a specific area. So a criterion comes from the Greek word kritis, which means to judge. A criterion then is a tool or an instrument used to make a judgment. So, again, judgment in general is to prove something to something or deny it. But depending on what tool I am using, my judgment can either be big or small. You see, judgment in general, as human beings always make judgments. Even if they're so primitive. If someone lives in the jungle, he's never seen civilization, he makes judgments. He sees an animal for the first time in his life or her life, they make a judgment whether to go near or to run away. That's a judgment. As human beings, we make a judgment whether we want to heat the water or drink it cold. We make a judgment whether we want to sleep or to stay awake. We, as human beings, we make judgments regardless. But what tool do I employ in order to make this judgment? Based on what am I taking that step? That varies now. That will now show us the spaciousness, the domain of our judgments. In other words, which tool I believe in or I am using will decide how many people I can talk to. So let's say, for example, leaving this aside, let's say, for example, I'm going to talk about the law, or I'm going to make judgments related to traffic, for example. Say, speed on the motorway is 100 miles an hour. That's wrong, isn't it? It's a wrong judgment. Regardless of whether it's wrong or right, someone might say to me, which tool are you applying? Is it British law or another law? Isn't it? So depending on what tool I'm using, I can say, well, this applies in Britain, it applies outside Britain, it applies to a small group of people. Let's make another judgment. We say, it's Ramadan. It's a judgment. It's Ramadan. The moon has been sighted. So I made that judgment based on a tool, based on a background, based on something. There is a reference point. So tomorrow is Ramadan. Therefore, we make a judgment. You have to fast. That's a judgment. You have to fast. Someone might say, well, I haven't seen the moon. Right? He might not accept that. Or another person might say, well, that he is not a Muslim. So he doesn't have to fast. So the criterion or the hakim, the instrument that I use to make a judgment decides that standard, the established standard or the principle on which a judgment is based decides how many people can be addressed with this judgment. Now, there are three criteria. The ulama, theologians have looked around and they said there are three criteria. What are they? Number one, norm. What's norm? Norm is like a legal system or what people agree on, convention. Let's say British people have a law that governs them. So that's a British norm. Muslims have a law that governs their actions. I mean by that law, the Sharia, fiqh, was halal and haram, isn't it? Because halal and haram tells us what is wajib, what is an obligation, what is a prohibition, what's a recommendation, what's a dislike. This is to tell us what to do or not to do. Some other people might have no British law, they have no Muslim law, but what do they have? They have some agreement, even if it's kind of a moral agreement. For example, respect for the elders. Elders deserve respect. Let's say people who have no law, they just agreed that elders deserve respect. That's the judgment. Based on what? Based on a norm. Dowry is paid by the groom to the bride. In some countries, it might be the other way around. It's paid by the bride to the groom. It's a normative thing. So the first category of judgments generally, based on the tool or the standard or the background I am using to make that judgment, is what we call normative judgment. Is norm. Some people, in some places, you call it legislation or law. Basically, what people agree on. So, for example, people in some countries, they have agreed that red, in many countries, red is the color, is the light which you turn on. When it's turned on, you can't proceed. So you should say that driving across red light is not allowed. You made a judgment. But based on what is this judgment? Based on what people have agreed on. Based on norm. What if in 50 years they decided that it's blue that stops people from driving through? What if in another 50 more years they just decided that green means don't go and red means go? Who has made this association? Who has associated red with not going and green with going? Who has made that judgment? Who has made that judgment? It's not the mind. It's not experience. What is it? It's the society. It's the norms of the society. So the first category, the first possible category of a judgment is a normative judgment, a legislative judgment. Like this example we normally give, fasting is an obligation. When I say fasting is an obligation, That's a judgment. That's based on what? That's based on law. It's the law of God. It's Islam. Eating pork is prohibited. Another person who believes in a completely different legal system, or believes in a different normative way, using a different normative tool, he might say eating pork is not prohibited. You see that? So now when we speak about judgments, then we have also to refer to what tool I'm using to make my judgments. Based on what? What is the standard? So this normative, they divide it into 5 categories. So 5 divisions of normative. Legal one. When it comes to Sharia, we have wujub, obligation, which means that you have to do an action, and if you don't, you're punished. So requesting the doing of something and punishing the one who doesn't. The opposite of that is requesting the avoidance of something and punishing the one who does. That's called hurma, haram, prohibited. And in between these two, if I say requesting, then I might request and punish the one who disobeys, or I might request and not punish the one who disobeys. So it's more recommendation. So we have prohibition, recommendation. I request to avoid prohibition, but I will not punish the one who does. That's called disliking. And then in between these 4, we have something in between that's called permissibility. There is no request and there is no prohibition. There is no request to do and there is no request to leave. These are the normative judgments. But we might be making our judgments not based on norm, not based on a legal system. It might be based on or by employing experience. Experience is not limited to a specific society. It's wider, isn't it? It's wider. So for example, experience or experiment is I have tried something, I found out the outcome of my action, I didn't decide to relate the outcome to the action because it's the first time. But I did it again and I got the same end. So I did it again and I got to the same end. I did it again, I got to the same end. After a few attempts, after a good number of attempts, I will realize, yes, every time I feel hungry and I eat, my hunger goes away. I'm not hungry anymore. That is based on what? Experience. It has nothing to do with the law of the land. It doesn't have anything to do with the law of the Sharia. It doesn't have anything to do with halal and haram. It is something to do with human experience. A person who lives in civilized society or a person who lives in the jungle will have the same experience, isn't it? It's the same experience. It doesn't really restrict itself. It doesn't require the person to be civilized to know that. It just requires the person to go through the experience to know that. If the person doesn't have the experience, yes. But for example, if a child puts his or her hand on a hot spoon and they feel the burn, they will take their hand away. If they do it a couple of times, they will learn and they will not touch a hot spoon again. Right? So this experience is in reality relating two things together. Relating two things together, either in a positive way or in a negative way. But it's not based on law. It is based on what? Empiricism. Trying something and failing or succeeding. So empirical judgments are those that establish a correlation between something and something else, like the correlation between food and hunger. So we say every time there is food and I eat it, I have food, I put food in my tummy, hunger disappears. Yes?
So would that be a relationship between cause and effect?
That's a relationship between cause and effect. So for example, every time I put fire underneath, I put a pot on my oven or my cooker and leave it for a while, the water or the liquid inside starts bubbling. I say, oh, the fire is the cause of the bubbling. I just made that correlation. Right? We will talk later about correlation and causation, right? And how we differentiate between both. But correlation between things normally is based on what? Experiment. So food as satiating, water as satiating, sun as the source of light, causing the light, or knife as the cause of cutting or killing, right? All of these things are numerable. Normally, we learn that when we see both of them. When we see that every time this exists, that exists. Remember one important thing, the author rahimahullah ta'ala speaks of. He says that some people have made mistake in mixing these empirical judgments with rational judgments. We will talk about rational judgments later. And they have thought that since cause and effect exist and correlate to one another, there is no way that they can fail. They will always exist. Oh, but that's a mistake. Right, that's a mistake. The third point of reference is rationality. The aql, the mind. And normally the aql or the mind judges not based on norm and not based on experience. It judges not based on what? Norm and not based on experience. Therefore, what is it based on? Based on whichever primordial nature Allah has given to it, God has given to it. What makes human beings human beings? When we define human beings, we say a human is what? Is a rational animal. Is a rational animal. So he has that rationality embedded in him. That rationality in its very basic form enables us to make simple judgments. Even without any experience, Like when we look around, we make a judgment that numbers are either odd or even. That doesn't need too much education. And it doesn't need the person to be in a society, even if the person is by himself or herself. They make these categorizations. I don't mean by numbers either odd or even that a person knows 1, 2, 3, 4, or how to write them. I'm talking about even classification. Even what? Classification. Children, for example, when you put them with some toys, what do? They observe the similarities and they start putting things together. Right? How did they make that relation? How did they divide things? Also, another example is in the mind, to judge that a being or something or an entity cannot both exist and not exist at the same time. The mind does not accept that. So if you look at your child and he says, "Well, here you are," and he says, no, I'm not here. What will they do? What will they do? They will laugh, isn't it? Because they see that as ridiculous. Without experience, without law of the land, without law of the society, without knowing halal or haram or anything. So the aql, the pure mind, has that exclusivity. What's that exclusivity? Exclusivity of one meaning that it does not allow the other. So when you say exist, what does it mean? Non-existence is not possible. You can't be right in front of me and not in front of me at the same time. At the same moment. Yes, you might be in front of me now, but not in front of me. Or you might be in front of me in a screen on a television, but not physically. You see that? Physically in front of me. Your image can be here, but your body is not here. But to prove both to the same person, in the same way, at the same moment, in the same manner, is impossible. Because the meaning of existence and the meaning of non-existence, these two meanings are mutually exclusive and totally exhaustive. They are mutually exclusive and totally exhaustive. I mean, if you say that something exists, then it excludes right away non-existence. If you say something that does not exist, it excludes right away existence. So that's what? Mutually exclusive. And what do you mean by totally exhaustive? Totally exhaustive, it means it encompasses the individual. So for example, if I say this page is, this is a white page, fully white, I would understand by you saying fully white, that it is not non-white. You can say it's white and non-white at the same time. But you can say it is neither white nor black. It's blue. So the aql, the mind, rationality, by referring back to human rationality, human beings have some basic things. Have some basic laws. Where did they get these laws from? That's a different discussion. They're born with them. They're born with these basic ideas. Mortimer Adler says that there is no way that you can keep requesting a proof for everything. There will be a point where you will reach what we call the axioms, the foregranted, the basic knowledge. So no one can say to me, so what is the proof that two contradictory states cannot exist at the same time? Because existence and non-existence are contradiction. There is contradiction between them. So someone says, what is the proof that contradictory things are mutually exclusive? Well, they are mutually exclusive. But what's the what's the proof? The proof is that they are mutually exclusive. But what is the proof? You say, well, this is a rational necessity. This is a rational necessity. This is a law of the mind. It's basic. But what's the proof? You reach a point where there has to be some basic things that we can move on from. Foundational concepts that makes human beings rational. If anyone accepts existence and non-existence of a being, oh, I can see him, oh, but he's not here, you will say this person is insane, right? You'll say that the person is what? He's either playing around or he is insane. What does insane mean? It means he does not have sanity. So if you say to an individual, two contradictory states are mutually exclusive, and he denies that, he says, no, what's the proof? You will ask him, are you sane? Yes. Are you insane? No. That's mutually exclusive. Isn't it? Are you sane? Yes. Are you insane? If he says yes. But if he says no, he's disproving himself, isn't it? He said, here you go. There are two contradictory, sanity and insanity are two contradictory things, and you have just proven it to yourself. If someone says, my statement is true and false, right? It's true and false. You say, okay, you're saying that trueness and falseness can happen at the same time. Is it true? Does it make sense? Again, if someone says something can be true and false at the same time, he claims that. You ask him, is there truth in that statement of yours? If he says, yes, then you say, you're wrong then. You have just disproved yourself. And if he says no, we'll say, why should I accept it then? But he can say it is and it is not. Something cannot be existence and non-existence. Again, why would we then say that it is impossible to go beyond these axiomatic things and we have to accept them as they are? Because if we keep going, then we fall into a fallacy called begging the question, which means that nothing can be proven. If you keep going on and on and on and on and on and on and on, then nothing can be proven. A good example of that, if I ask this brother, give me 20 pounds, and he said, I don't have 20 pounds. Let me ask the brother next to me. The brother next to him said, well, I've got no 20 pounds. Let me ask the brother next to me. If we keep going in an unbroken chain, eternally, I will never get the 20 pounds. Right? But the fact that I get the 20 pounds, it means someone, somewhere, at certain point has given the 20 pounds. So there is a point A that we can start from. Always there is a point A that we can start from. So looking around us, seeing the universe, things have potentiality. It's possible that the heating works or it doesn't. The fact that it worked, it means someone has actualized that potential. Now this person, is he himself actual or potential? If he's potential, then someone must have what? Actualized him. Keep going on until you have to come to something that is actual. That's not moved. If everything is moved, then that thing is what? Is unmoved. We use the same proof, by the way, to prove the existence of God. This is called the Aristotelian proof, the unmoved mover. I was given an example to the brothers the other day. If you look at this laptop is about a meter away from the floor. It could have been lower than that or higher than that. The fact that it's in that position, something must be holding it. And what's holding it is the table. What's holding the table? The floor. And what's holding the floor? The earth. And what's holding that? You keep going like that. So referring back to rationality, to reason, then this is called hukm aqli. We call this the rational judgment. So what's a rational judgment then? These are the categories of judgment. A rational judgment of things, entities, could be either by referring back to the mind, referring back to the human rationality, which we are all have, alhamdulillah, as human beings. We can judge things around us as being possible or necessity or absurdity. What is that? What do you mean by that? Let's say, for example, that you think of two things by referring back to the mind. And you imagined that what if the relation between these is negation? Is saying, for example, the universe, which is contingent, which is created, which is potential, has no actualizer. Can you believe that? Your mind will say, no. The fact that it moved from one state to another, it couldn't have moved itself. Something else, someone else must have moved it. We hear a knock on the door. Your mind works right away and tells you, go out and check. Why? Because it couldn't be that the door has knocked itself. Isn't it? So your mind works directly and said, something must have hit the door and caused the knock. Then you go out, there is nothing. Then you listen, possibly it is windy and the wind carried something and hit the door. But it's not windy. Possibly it's a crack in the door, possibly it's a cat, possibly it's a dog, possibly this, possibly that. So you're looking around means you're looking for what? For what has actualized that potential. It was possible that the door knocks or not. That the door makes a noise or not. The fact that it moved from one state to another, it was silent. The fact that it moved from one state to another, there must have been an actualizer. So your mind does not imagine, meaning your mind says that for this to be moved, there has to be a mover. That is called what? That's called necessity. Rational necessity. Why? Because rational necessity means the intellect priori data or premises which have the status of first principles, we call them the first principles, to move on its process of judging. So these are called what? These are called the rational principles. Based on these rational principles, human beings make judgments like two contradictories cannot be both true, cannot both be true, can they be and false. A person cannot be Muslim and non-Muslim at the same time, right? Unless he's a Muslim now, and then later he's not a Muslim, and then he's a Muslim again, and then he's not Muslim. It does not exist, it does not concur at the same time. Now the aql, the mind, when it judges, it looks at things, and it says, well, that which cannot be denied by the intellect is called rational necessity. Like the negativeness of which is not comprehensible to the intellect. I mean, it is not possible for the intellect to imagine that this universe is without a creator. There has to be. Everything in the universe, as I said, change, movement, contingency. Would you imagine a child without a mother or without a father or without anything, without a mover that moves it from non-existence to existence, whether it's direct or indirect? So indirect is through family, direct is through creation. Would you imagine you come to this room and you see this book is open, and then you go out and come back and it's closed? You imagine something must have closed it, possibly the window. So rational necessity is a hukm or a judgment, which means that I cannot deny that. I cannot deny that intellectually. But what if a person denies it? Like someone says, there is nothing called God. The universe has created itself. We say you're committing a logical fallacy here. Which is what? Which is this universe. Is this universe a potential or actual? Is it potential or actual? Actual is potential. It's potential. So what makes it actual? Everything in the universe is what? Is potential. The homes around us are potential because you can build them, you can destroy them. Human beings are potential. Life is potential. Death is potential. Human beings come to this world and then leave. So everything that is potential has to have what? Someone to move it from one to the other. One option to the other. And that thing itself can be potential. If you keep going, there has to be an actualizer, an unmoved mover. For you to deny that is impossible. So if your mind cannot imagine its absence, then this is called rational necessity. So a rational necessity or a rationally necessary thing is that which cannot be denied by the intellect. That the negativeness of which is not comprehensible to the intellect, or that which cannot be denied by the intellect. Now, this can either be immediate or mediate. This rationally necessary can be intermediate or mediate. What do you mean by intermediate and immediate and mediate? We mean by mediate that you don't need to think and reason for a long time to reach that. So for example, when I imagine matter, I always imagine that it occupies space. Can you ever imagine matter without its occupation of space? So when I say, for example, a car, you always ask, where did you leave your car? Where is your car? The fact that you ask where, soul, human soul. When a person dies, you say, his soul has left his body. That means there was a matter occupying another space. A house, a bird, a human being, any matter normally occupies what? Space. Air is a matter. It occupies space. That's an immediate thing. Human beings normally know that without having to reflect. But saying that God is eternal, that's not immediate. That's actually mediate. What do you mean by mediate? You require some thinking to reach that. If I want to say to someone that God is eternal, I have to explain to them what do you mean by eternality. And why God has to be eternal. He cannot be contingent. He cannot be created. Because if He's created, then we go back to who created Him? Right? And then if someone else has created Him, then who created the Creator? And you keep going on like that. So to understand that God, one of the attributes of God is that He is beyond time. Time restrictions do not apply to God. This is something that's rationally necessity. It's a rational necessity. It's not rationally necessary. Why is it necessary? Because your mind cannot visualize, cannot imagine the absence of that. If you just imagine the absence of that, you're breaking the law of the mind. You will ask the question, so you're turning the actual to potential, while this actual can never be a potential. Any of us can be actual and potential, but there is absolute actual. Then we have rational absurdity. What's rational absurdity? Rational absurdity is simply the opposite, the contradiction of rational necessity. So that which cannot be affirmed by the intellect. The mind cannot accept that. The affirmation of which causes or breaks the rational sanity. The affirmation of that is not comprehensible to the intellect. And that again can either be immediate or mediate. An immediate thing is, for example, substance free from movement and stillness at the same time. Any substance around us, any human being, any created thing is either still or what? Or what? Moving. Whether we can measure the movement or we don't measure the movement, that's not the issue. Because if you can't see the movement, but you can measure it with something else. We're looking at the stars and other planets. We don't see them moving, but they're definitely moving, isn't it? You might see a car which is moving very fast, and you might think it's still, but in fact it's what? Moving. You look up the sky and you see a plane and you think it's actually still, but in fact it is what? Moving. Illusion of the senses is a different thing. But these things are measurable. But you can't say it is still and moving at the same time. Any substance, any body, any created thing cannot be moving. As they say, look, I give that example, that sign, what does it say? No putting signs. Do you get that? It says no putting signs, but it's a sign. Isn't that a contradiction? Or I gave an example before in the previous slide. This guy. What is he saying? I'm never wrong. I thought I was once, but I was mistaken. He said, I'm never wrong. Once I thought that I was wrong, but I was mistaken. How can that be? Right? How can that be? By the same token, this guy has just decided no signs, or no putting of signs, but you just did that. So a rational absurdity is to imagine something and its contradiction at the same time. The mind says, no. This is mutually exclusive. I can't imagine this. I can't imagine a God who is absolute, no beginning, but at the same time someone else has given him life. That's not a God then. So human beings are either absolute or contingent. Beginningless or beginning. You're either tall or not tall. You're either alive or not alive. You can't say I'm alive and not alive at the same time. The mind doesn't accept that. So that's rational absurdity. But immediate rational absurdity, something that requires a bit of thinking, is if some people want to prove to us that God cannot be a substance. That requires, it is impossible for God to be a substance. It's impossible for God to have a physical hand or to occupy space, for example. It's impossible. It's rational absurdity. It's absurd. But why is it absurd? It's not something that you can just your mind clicks to it right away. You need someone to explain to you. You say, listen, if God can occupy space, or he has physical hand, or he has a physical face, or he has a physical leg, or he has what we call objectives like us. You honor someone because you want them to praise you or to thank you. So if he has objectives for his actions, then what's the difference between him and creation? If he had a hand, we normally have hands because we need them to help us lift things. But if God has a hand, why would he need it? Why would he need one? Right? Or if God occupies space or sits on a chair or something like that, then where was he before the place? Where was he before the space? So that requires a bit of thinking, mediacy. So that's rational absurdity as well. And then the third judgment of the mind. So the mind can either go to extremes. It says, well, this has to be, or this can't be, or yes, maybe. It's fine. It's acceptable. What is that? That's called rational possibility. What's a rational possibility? Rational possible is something whose existence and non-existence the intellect can affirm. Meaning the mind can accept that it is there and can accept that it's not there at two different times. Like, we accept movement and stillness. The combination of both at the same time is impossible. But each one independently, yes. You might say the car is moving. The car is not moving. Not at the same time, two different times. Why? Because movement and stillness is one of the properties one of the qualities, one of the attributes of created things. Right? When we say, for example, a human being was born, a human being died. So came into existence, left physical existence. Came, left. We accept both. We accept birth and death. Birth means appearance of something, appearance of a being after it was not there. Death means its disappearance after it was there. You can't have both at the same time, but you accept both independently. So you can say, yes, so-and-so was born 70 years ago. Okay? You believe that, even if you have not seen it. Or he passed away last week. Okay? Imagine, I gave that example to some students last week. Imagine if there is an elder uncle lives next door to you, and for the last 50 years or 30 years or whichever number of years, you've been seeing this uncle every single day walking to the mosque. Every single day walking to the mosque. That he almost became a daily phenomenon. Or he became like a salah timetable. He tells you when salah is on. And then all of a sudden, you wake up in the morning, you don't see him. And they said, oh, he passed away last night. Will your mind refuse that? Your mind will accept it. You will say, oh, Allah bless his soul. That means your mind has accepted it. Why? Because that individual, that uncle was contingent. Meaning he had the possibility of existing and not existing. Your mind accepts that it might take this route or not that route. Or this route but not this route. So whenever there is options, rational options, not social options, rational options, then the mind accepts one of them at a time. That this is moving. Oh, now it's not. Temperature is high. Now it is not. This person is born. Now he's no more alive. This person is awake. Now he is asleep. That is immediate. That's immediate rational possibility. But sometimes the rational possibility is not immediate. It requests or it requires what we can call a bit of thinking. Like what? We say in theology, giving an example to this, we say, like Allah punishing someone who lived a life of virtue. A Muslim lived all his life believing in Allah, praying 5 times a day, fasting, honest, righteous, good. And then in the end, Allah says to you, but I'll put him in hellfire. Another individual, he drinks, he kills, he does all forms of obscenity and vices, and then in the end, he gets to a good place. That's rationally possible. But human beings might find that difficult to swallow. Why? Why do they find that difficult to swallow? Because we normally judge based on our own parameters. I always think a just society is the one that treats those who live a virtuous life in a good way. And those who live a non-virtuous life, they are to be treated in a different way. A place for criminals who insist on their criminality is prison, isn't it? Oh, but that's social life. That's because the government has limited power. It's the power that people have given to it. The power of the government is limited to what? Limited to authority. The government has not created you. The government organizes society. But the one who has created you, the one who has the over and upper hand on you, his actions are not free from motives. Your actions, our actions as human beings, government actions, United Nations actions are always motivated by something, isn't it? They're motivated by something. If they decide, for example, to bombard a certain city and say, this is really unfair, this is injustice, or you looked at a perspective, because their actions are what? Motivated. If they say to you, look, there was a lot of terrorists in this place and we had to bombard it, your moral compass might change, or you might say, well, I still see this as unjustifiable action. You might say, well, okay, that's justifiable enough. That's not justifiable at all. But that's because what? Because their power is limited. Their actions are motivated. Their actions have a purpose. But God's actions, they are not motivated. He doesn't get anything in return. Or United Nations bombarding that piece of land, they will say, so that we have peace in the world. Motivation. You disagree or agree, that's a different thing. But God's actions are not motivated. You do someone some favor, and he says, thank you, that's really nice of you. And they don't thank you in return. You say, this is really bad. You judge this as bad and judge this as good because your action is motivated. But God's actions are not what? Motivated. He doesn't get anything from someone who is obedient, nor does he or is he harmed in any way by someone who lives a life of vice. The one who gets that is who? Is who? Is the human being. They say ظلم, which is injustice, هو التصرف على خلاف الأمر, is to do something in opposition to what you have commanded. Isn't it? To what you have commanded. You say to someone, do this, and I'll do this in return. So if you don't, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's because you have what? You have a moral responsibility to abide by your word. But if God is the absolute controller of actions and destinies, you can't hold him accountable. Some Muslims have tried to do this, apply this rationality, this human limited rationality, and they have fallen into big troubles. So that issue of divine justice is possible. Yeah, we would accept that as a possibility. Break. Just I'll read a few things and then we go into break. So before we go into break, I want to read to you two things. Number one, what are the priorities or the intellectual priorities or the self-evident things? They are the propositions whereby simply a proper conception, this is the definition, a proper conception of the components of that proposition leads to the knowledge of the truth or falsity. So what is an axiomatic knowledge or an axiomatic principle or a priori, intellectual priori? It's a principle or a proposition. Just by knowing its parts, you make the judgment. You'll know. You don't need experience. Like they say, Al-kull akbar min al-juz. A whole is bigger than its part. Right? You don't need experience to know that a whole is bigger than its part. So these premises, these self-evident, they do not need a proof. It is impossible to seek proof for them. Right? It's impossible to seek proof of them. So you can't say a whole is bigger than its part and part is bigger than its whole. It's impossible. You'll say it's impossible. One has to be bigger than the other. Right? I'm also going to read the issue of absurdity I gave an example of absurdity, and I said an example of absurdity is to have two gods. That photo, like no science, the one next to no science, having two gods. Why is it impossible? Why is it absurd to have two gods? There can be two or more of a kind only if there is something to differentiate them, isn't it? Whether it is in features or it is in number. So you say 1, 2 in number. Or you say, oh, this is small, this is big. Why do we need to have two ears? Why not one? Even if they are identical. Why? Because we can't grasp all the sounds unless we have two. So there can be two or more of a kind only if there is something to differentiate them. Something that one instance has and the other lacks. Where the purely actual is concerned, when we speak about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there can be no differentiation. Is one pure, therefore he cannot be distinguished or differentiated, right? So that oneness of God is a necessity, and the existence of another God is what? Is absurdity, right? Is absurdity. It requires a bit of thinking because it's not an immediate thing, but in the end, the understanding of that is possible. Imam al-Sunusi concludes this by saying, rahimahullah ta'ala, he says, knowing these three categories of the intellectual or rational ruling, he says, this is rationality. This is rationality. This is sanity. So if a person does not have these three embedded, meaning there is some basic foundational concepts and judgments in the mind that he says, that's possible, that's impossible, that's necessary, he says, فَلَيْسَ بِعَاقِلٍ. Then this person is not aqil, he is not rational, he is not sane, he is insane. So why do we then, I'm sure that everyone in this room, alhamdulillah, is sane. So why do we need to repeat these? He says, وَمَعْرِفَتُهَا, knowing these, وَتَكْرِيرُهَا, repeating them, تأنيس للقلب. It's a form of giving support to the mind, that we're not going insane when we see this insanity that is around us. When we see people talking about illusion, that everything is elusive. I was reading, subhanAllah, I'm reading these days a book by Glenn called History of Philosophy. So the pre-Socratic philosophy and post-Socratic philosophy. So before Socrates came, there were 6 schools of philosophy in Greece. One of them, the last one of them, is called the Sophists. And there is actually many schools called Sophists. But they all agree on one thing. There is like one foundational feature. They say that there is no objective reality. This is what they say. There is no objective reality. It means everything is subjective. You want to see it as a wall, no problem. I want to see it as a window, no problem. So they believe in what we call subjectivity. There is no reality of anything, of objects. But we as human beings now, we have moved from subjectivity of concepts to subjectivity of everything. So gender is no more objective. It is what? Subjective. Family is no more objective. It is what? Subjective. Belief is no more objective. It is subjective. As I gave the example before, if someone says, well, everything is subjective, there is no truth, you ask them, so you claim that there is no truth of anything, does it have a reality in itself? If they say yes, then they fall into contradiction. If they say no, you say, why should I follow it then? Right? So subhanAllah, if you read history, and how philosophical schools have emerged, you see kind of a line going up from materialism, denial of realities, subjectivity, and then philosophy goes up to the time of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And then after that, it goes back to sophists. Now we are in the lower point of human intellectual history, where we moved from materialism, tried to ascend. Socrates and Plato and these people were kind of a step towards prophethood. And then prophethood gives us the reality coming from revelation, and then human beings fall back into the same linear intellectual decline, into materialism. Pre-Socratic philosophy was focusing on materialism, materialistic things. And now we live in a very material world. That's why sufficing human beings are stopping at that point. Normative is quite problematic. Empirical is what they believe in. I believe in empiricism. And since empiricism can vary from one person to the other, even that is unclear. Right? Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. So have a break, inshallah. So, move from the rational judgments and the categories of rational judgments, he goes on to first things first. If we say that Aqidah is not just knowing something but believing in it, and if we also say that faith in Islam, in the Muslim mind, faith is a positive thing. Al-Iman al-Tasdiqi, they call it Al-Iman al-Tasdiqi. Because faith, Iman, is defined as an assent. When you say God exists, that's an assent. That's a judgment. And accepting that, if it's an assent and a judgment, it's based on intellectual judgment, then theologians transform this idea into Iman al-Tasdiq, which means that it's not just acknowledgement of the truth. You're not just acknowledging the truth. If you just acknowledge the truth without knowing that, but you have to know that this is the truth. You can't just base your faith on acknowledging the truth, but you have also to know that this is the truth. Then faith is a positive knowledge. In Islam, faith is positive knowledge that is acquired by free will. So what if it is negative knowledge? I mean by negative knowledge, it's something that I receive from someone else. That's negative knowledge. Someone gave me, like someone watching a television, and he just takes whatever they throw at him or at her. This is not then a valid faith. This is not valid faith. So we have a religious duty to know. As our brother was mentioning earlier, that he starts by saying, "I'lam." He did not say, he said at the beginning of the book, he said what? "I'lam anna al-hukm al-aqli." You have to know this. Why? What if you don't know? I'm reminding you. What if you know? You need to bring this knowledge from the back of your conscious to the front of your mind and put it in front of you all the time, so that when you move into your journey of faith, you know why are you doing that. So he goes on, once I have that knowledge, then he says, وَيَجِبُ عَلَى كُلِّ مُكَلَّفٍ شَرْعًا أَنْ يَعْرِفَ ما يجب في حق مولانا عز وجل أو جل وعز وما يستحيل وما يجوز. According to the sacred law, it is an obligation, it's obligatory upon every legally responsible person to know what is necessary for our Master, subhanahu wa ta'ala, the sublime and the majestic, as well as what is impossible, meaning what's absurd, what is not befitting, and what's possible for him. وَكَذَا يَجِبُ عَلَيْهِ أَنْ يَعْرِفَ مِثْلَ ذَلِكَ. It's equally an obligation to know these things في حق الرسل عليهم الصلاة والسلام, as they apply to messengers, peace and blessings be upon them. Why is it then necessary to know? Why is knowledge? What is knowledge? We said before, we talked about that before, we said al-ma'rifah, knowledge, is certainty that's free from doubt. So if a person says, I don't know, that's ignorant, this wall that's far from you, the end of this hole, and I say, how far is this wall from you? If someone says, probably 5 meters, that's actually lower. This is definitely X amount of meters. So knowledge, then you can say, I know. Now you can say, I know. So someone might say to you, why are you a Muslim? I heard them saying that. I grew up in a family and I asked them, this guy, John, is Catholic. This person is Buddhist. That person in school, that boy in school, he wears a turban all the time, he's sick. That other individual, he's an atheist. And they said, we are Muslims. We call ourselves Muslims. I said, okay, I am a Muslim then. Is that person then really aware of why he is what he claims himself to be? He's not. He's just imitating. So if someone says to him, well, can you prove to me why are you a Muslim? What makes you different from another individual? He won't be able to. Only when he knows, only when he learns, only when he is able to prove to himself, even without verbal exposition, just mentally, has that certainty, he has no doubt, then we can say that this person has knowledge. So knowledge is certainty that's free from doubt, and it has to be in compliance with reality. What if you know something and you have no doubt about it, but it's not in compliance with reality? You believe, for example, that we are in another planet. It's not in compliance with reality. That's not knowledge. So knowledge has to be free from doubt, it has to be in compliance with reality, and it has to be based on what? Evidence. You have to have evidence. You have to be able to prove it to yourself so that no one can shake it. So when truth becomes, so why is it important in Islam to find truth ourselves? Why is it important to base our faith on truth and truth finding? Because when truth, and why is truth have to be objective? It can't be subjective. I can't just say, you know what, you want to believe in Buddha, you're right. This person wants to believe in another God, he's right. This person wants to believe not to believe in God, he's right. And we Muslims believe it, we're right. Why can't it be subjective or relative thing? And it has to be objective truth, and we have to seek it and go out and find it. Why? Because that makes us active. It makes us use our brains. It makes us use our intellect, which God has given to us. Otherwise, people will become what? Intellectually lazy. We will become intellectually lazy. If everyone is right, why do I have to explore? Why do I have to ask myself? Why can't I just be like that? So that's why taqleed, imitation, is a lazy engagement with truth. Why? Someone else did it for you. Right? Someone else did it for you. You can't base your iman on someone else's experience. So because faith is defined as an assent and acceptance, so faith is a positive knowledge acquired by free will. Now, imitation-based faith. What about imitation-based faith? And we talk about, when we say imitation-based faith, we mean by that, someone has told me and I didn't even think about it, I just took it as it is. Do we have to know? Do we have individually, at least, to have some form of evidence to prove faith to ourselves? The ulama have differed. There is khilaf. There is difference of opinion. And why there is difference of opinion, I'll tell you first. Ulama of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah are torn between two things. One is the heaviness, the heavy weight of Iman, that you can't just take it lightly. You can't just take it as exported by somebody else to you. So you have to make that your individualized search. That's one issue. The other issue is embracing everyone into the fold of faith, even with the smallest claim that they are believers. So if someone says, I am a Muslim, should we just take it as face value? Or should we say, no, you are not a Muslim until you seek truth yourself? They are torn between these two. We have a religious duty to accept from people whatever they say, and we have also a religious duty to make sure that our faith is strong. Because of these two, and these are kind of equally important, there is difference of opinion. So Al-Ghazali, Ibn Rushd, Imam Al-Qushayri, and Abdullah ibn Abi Jamrah said that reflection. What's reflection? Reflection is thinking, ordered and organized thinking that leads you to a conclusion. So when we say your faith cannot be based on imitation, we say you have to think, you have to look around, you have to do some form of activity, intellectual activity, that gives you at least a conclusion that there must be a God to yourself. Once you come to that, that's it. Anything else you can receive from authorities, you can receive from a teacher, you can receive from others. But the first duty, which is what? Which is using your intellect. Imagine that. You might need a mechanic to fix your car, or to show you, an instructor to show you how to drive. But at least, you need to put the key of the car into the keyhole and turn it on. You need to do that. Anything else you can learn. So that putting of the key into the keyhole is stirring your mind and reflecting. Nazar. That is important. Imam al-Ghazali said, so the controversy is a reflection, nazar, is thinking, and having that essential deliberation. Is it necessary for your faith to be valid or not? In other words, if someone says, I just heard them saying this, I took it, can we say that this person's faith is valid? It's not based on, he didn't do anything to prove it to himself. Is this faith strong enough that it can stand against doubt? Or it's very weak that it will fall? So if it's very weak and it can fall, it will fall, shall we consider it as if it doesn't exist at all? Or shall we consider it to exist? Or shall we consider it to exist but it's incomplete? So you say, yes, okay, but your faith is incomplete. Why? Because it's not strong enough. Imagine if someone building a wall, and then he got a piece of plastic or anything, and he tucked it in between two pillars. Will we consider this to be a wall? Or would you say, well, it's a wall, but it's incomplete. You need to kind of fortify it, you need to staple it. Or would we say, it's a wall of a sort. It's a wall. So is it strong enough? Or is it not strong at all? Or is it strong? Imam al-Ghazali, Ibn Abi Jamrah, and this group of scholars, they said, reflection is not a condition. It's not an obligation. It is a condition of perfection. Meaning, if someone has faith, has belief, without reflecting, without thinking individually, their faith is okay. It's not perfect, but it's okay. They didn't say it's perfect. They didn't say it's absolutely fine. They said it's okay, it's accepted. We take that as a bare minimum. Why did they say that? Because they wanted to embrace as many people as they could. But Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari and the majority of the ulama, including al-Baqillani and al-Juwayn, who were great theologians, they said, no. That doesn't work. They said the person has to know. Knowledge is a duty. Imitation is not enough. You can just take it from somebody else. Someone said, oh, there is a God. I said, okay, there is a God. Or someone said, well, there is one God. And I said, oh yeah, there is one God. You have to know why. Not necessarily that you know it in a way that you have to go and give a talk about it, or write an article about it, or even verbally speak it out, as long as your heart has this itmi'nan, this relaxation with it. So, if they say that knowledge is what? Is a duty, and imitation is not enough. So when we say imitation is not enough, what about it? What about someone who has based his faith on imitation? Is he then a believer but disobedient? Because they said what? Imitation is what? It's not enough. If imitation is not enough, and still I based my faith on imitation. Does that mean that my faith is valid but I'm disobedient? Imagine if someone says to you, you have to pray. The bare minimum is Fatiha and an ayah, or no. So what a person says, well, I'll do Fatiha only throughout my salah. If that person consistently is persisting on not reciting a surah after Fatiha or anything else, just Fatiha, that's it, we can say that this person, well, his salah is valid, but he's disobedient. Or can we say that his salah is what? Is valid? Or here, is this person a believer but he's disobedient? Or he is a believer, disobedient only if he has the means to reflect, but he didn't? So here there is a bit of more detail. What if this person has no education whatsoever? Very simple individual. They can't even reason in any way. And I said, well, they said the whole village is a Muslim village. Okay, I am a Muslim as well. I said, but you have to reflect. He said, what does reflect mean? You have to think. What does think mean? Some people are like that. They don't even know how to think. You don't know what thinking is. So that person, his iman, the iman of that individual, the ulama said, is this person's iman valid? Well, if we say that it's valid, then is he disobedient because he has neglected a duty? If we say that knowledge is a duty, neglecting a duty, does it make you disobedient? The first group said yes. That's one opinion. That's the disobedient. Second group said, well, he's disobedient only if he has the means. What if he doesn't have the means? What if he can't? So there is a bit of details. Or can we go as far as saying what? If knowledge is a duty and imitation is not enough, it means a person who takes his iman from others without any reflection, he's not a believer. That's how dangerous it is. That's how serious it is. So there is also khilaf. So we have two strands of scholars. A group of scholars said, let's embrace people. You don't have to reason everything. That's Al-Ghazali and others. But yet it will be perfect if you can. Another group said, no. Yes, go on.
Is there an official position in the Ashari school?
Yeah.
Which of these opinions is right, or they're all rajih?
No. We'll see the official position. The official position is the middle one. The official position is that this person is not disobedient unless he has the ability and he neglected it. Imam al-Sunusi, the author of this text, he had two opinions. His early opinion in this book was the last one. He was of the opinion that if you don't reflect, you are what? You're not Muslim. He was very harsh. Imam al-Sunusi at the beginning, he said, وجوب النظر, this is his choice, وجوب النظر, that it's an obligation to reflect. مع التردد في كونه شرط صحة. He said there is kind of hesitation whether it's a condition of validity. He said والراجح, that's his choice in this book. والراجح, his choice is أنه شرط صحة, that's a condition of validity, which means that if the person does not have a bit of reasoning, his iman is what? Is invalid. So he was of the last opinion, but he changed that later. He wrote Sughra al-Sughra, which is smaller version of this. This is Sughra, then Sughra al-Sughra, and then he said, وَلَوْ حَصَلَ مِنْهُ جَزْمٍ, if the person has confirmation. He says, well, I am a Muslim. مُطَابِقٌ لِنَفْسِ مَا فِي الْأَمْرِ إِلَّا أَنَّهُ لَمْ يَكُنْ عَنْ ضَرُورَةٍ وَلَا عَنْ بُرْهَانٍ. But this confirmation, this faith is not based on darura, immediacy, or a proof. وإنما كان عن تقليد, it's based on imitation. ففي ذلك طرق, there is different opinions. وأقوال, and there are different sayings here. أصحها, the most authentic, أنه يجب عليه البحث, that he has to search مهما كانت فيه قابلية, if he has the ability to. So he moved from the lower one to the middle one. So he agreed with the majority. The majority have always said the person who imitates another individual without having any proof to support himself with, this individual is disobedient if he is able and he has neglected that religious duty. But if he is very simple, then his iman is what? Is valid. Right, so that's the chosen opinion. So what's imitation? Who is an imitator? Who is an imitator? Sheikh Sa'id Fuda has a good explanation. He said, Al-Muqallid, the imitator, is someone who confirms a valid aqidah, but without any proof. For example, a teacher says to the students in a madrasa, we are Muslims. He says, okay, we are Muslims. Or this person bases his faith on the urf, the norm of the society. He grows up in a Muslim country. So I grew up in a Muslim country, then I must be what? A Muslim. That individual, even though this is enough, this is the valid view now, this is enough, but the person has to seek proof. Has to what? Seek proof. Why? Because he might be tested at any point in his life. He says, بِقَدْرِ مَا يُطِيقُ. He should do that as much as he can. وَلَا يُقال, we cannot say, أنه يجب على الناس جميعا الغوص في معرفة دقائق علم التوحيد. We can't say that everyone has to delve into theological proofs. It's unachievable. But some people, it's enough for them just to know the general proof. For some people, we might ask them to do more. And this is very important for today. Today, we will not require that from every single Muslim. But Muslims who live in the West, at least they have to have a bit of proof for themselves. What if a person has doubts? Then we say, if you have doubts, you need to go and steer clear of these doubts and find the truth and remove these doubts by seeking proper knowledge. Yes, brother.
I just wanted to ask, if someone says that they're a Muslim, but then about God, they don't know exactly what the necessary things and the impossible things, so would they still be classed as a Muslim, although they don't have that knowledge?
As long as the person has the general knowledge about God, they don't need to know the tafsil. So they don't need to know the 20 attributes that we'll be talking about. But you ask them, so what do you know about God? They say, God is the creator. He's the one with absolute control. Everything good is God. Everything bad is not God. That's enough. That's what we call al-iman al-ijmali. That's kind of a general iman. So the person doesn't have to say, well, I know qidam, baqa, mukhalafa al-hawadith, and all of these single attributes. But if the person doesn't have to have this. So an imitation is when someone accepts faith without any individual attempt of verifying the truth, whether what has been given to them is truth or not. Imagine if someone says to you, it is raining outside. And they didn't even look from the window to see if it's raining or not. You just decided to take an umbrella and go out. Or someone said to you, it's really hot, extremely hot, you don't have to put any coat. You just say, okay, I'm going out without a coat. Normally when you do that based on what? Believing the person or disbelieving them, isn't it? And you believe them or you disbelieve them because you have given them, they have some credit in your life. You have tried them and tested them before. So when someone tells you, your parents tell you, I trust my parents. And look, if this universe is like that, it can't come without a creator. That's enough evidence. That's proof. That removes away imitation. If someone simply says, this universe can't be functioning without a creator, that's enough. Yes?
Is it right for me to think that Imam Sunusi's early position was that he wanted every Muslim to know about God, what is necessary and what is because
Yeah. And another thing is, ulama generally, any seeker of knowledge, they take time to mature. So you will find people at the beginning of their seeking of knowledge, they're very difficult in philosophizing things and using big words and all of that. With time, they start kind of reaching out to everyone, trying to kind of simplify things. So possibly Imam al-Sunusi, with time, he has kind of calmed down. So imitation-based faith. As I said, what do we need to know? Yes, we need to know. Unless the person doesn't have the ability to, so his iman or her iman is still valid. So what's nazar then, that we talked about, reflection? It's an organized process of thinking, inferring, that's methodical, modeled in such a manner that it leads to knowledge and realization, or at least high probability. Because remember that not in everything we can have 100% realization. There are certain things that will still remain as what? Higher probability. So for example, is it, for someone who doesn't even believe in Islam, is akhirah, is resurrection and accountability a higher probability? Yes. Why? Because just without listening to a prophet, without reading revelation, looking around us, in this life there is always accountability. Action, choice, there is accountability. So, and this life finishes with a lot of stories not ended. There is many stories and there is many controversies and there is many disputations that are not settled in this life. So there must be something. Otherwise, the complete picture is not achieved in this life. So that's high probability. Then when the person believes, we believe in akhirah, not because of that, but because our Prophet ﷺ told us, so we trust him. Therefore we believe in it. So for us, this is knowledge. It's based on what? It's based on evidence, right? But when we speak about akhirah, we normally put that at the very end of aqeedah. Why? Because it's a textually based thing. So you have to believe first in a source of knowledge, and then you have to believe in a medium of knowledge, and then you have to believe in the knowledge itself. Yes, go on.
So someone who has grown up in that custom where they are Muslim because the society, the family, what if that person comes to a realization through spiritual experience but doesn't know the rational proofs, but they're at a stage where you can't phase them? So for example, whenever they make dua, it's always accepted, so, and because they've been told, there's only one God, Allah, so they don't know the proofs. But
he doesn't need to know the details of the proofs, but he needs to relate things together. But what do you mean by spiritual experience here? Inspiration, they were inspired?
Or maybe, for example, there's one God, ask him and he'll give you. So they, through their process of making dua, for example, whatever they ask, they give them.
It could be deception. Remember that what we're talking about here is not empirical. It has to be rational. And in why do we exclude the empirical evidence here? Because the empirical evidence here can be very, very deceptive. It can be very deceptive. So I'm covering this now. So the question is it nazar that leads to knowledge? Is it reflection, rational reflection, that leads to knowledge that's required? So what about immediacy? Can we know through immediacy? I mean by knowing through immediacy, darura. Is it possible that we just know that God exists, we're born with that knowledge? No. Why? So these are things that Imam Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi tackled. He said, is it possible that we're all born with a pre-installed program saying that there is a God? No. Why? Because if it were so, all sane people would have known that there is a God. But you look around, some people believe, some people do not believe, some people know, some people don't know. So you can't just know, you can't just achieve that knowledge by immediacy. Another question would be, is inspiration the root? Can we just be inspired? No. Then all human beings would have to be inspired. Right? They would have to be inspired. Unless you make dua, what if this dua just happened to be? Remember, correlation is not what? Causation. So you made dua, give us some rain. The rain came down. Remember that not every action that breaks the law of nature is perceived as a miracle. Not every action that breaks the law of nature is what? Is perceived as a miracle. How would we differentiate magic from miracles? There is something called ihana. There is something called istidraj. Musaylim al-kadha. Ihana is istidraj, is allowing someone who is really bad to get something that proves their point as a way of making them believe themselves. Ad-Dajjal will be able to cut a person in half and bring him together and say, hey, look at that. Why is it important for us to use our minds? Because visual senses generally deceive us. I had that conversation with my wife yesterday. The Prophet ﷺ says that before the day of judgment, لا تقوم الساعة حتى تعبد الأصنام في جزيرة العرب. That idols will be worshipped again in the Arabian Peninsula. So my wife said, human beings can't be so stupid that they will worship idols. I said, look at what this history of philosophy says. There is a decline. Human beings started in a very materialistic way. Human thinking started with what? Materialism. We look around us. This is the environment that we have. We think only about materialistic stuff. And then we start moving away from materialism until we reach the hype, the epics of revelation. And then when people go down, go back to materialism. But people will worship idols. I said, they don't have to call them idols. It could be, have you heard of scientific miracles? This is a miracle of science, right? We hear this combination, isn't it? Look, science is doing miracles. But being scientific means you don't believe in miracles, isn't it? Or someone says, I believe in science. I don't believe in faith, I believe in science. Well, science is not there to believe in. You don't believe in science. Because believing in something means you submit to it. And you just say that I do not accept faith because dogmatism allows me or asks me to submit to it, while science doesn't allow me to submit to it. So if science doesn't allow you to or doesn't want you to submit to it, how come that you believe in science? Or someone says, I believe in evolution. Right? Based on what? Empirical evidence. Okay? What are these empirical evidence? If you take them one by one, they don't even get to the higher probability. They don't get even to higher probability. The maximum is possibly 51%. The maximum you can say about evolution is like 50-50. Like a few weeks ago, there was an article in BBC that they have discovered certain like fossils and stuff like in Ethiopia that prove that not the the first man, the Neanderthal was developed from apes. They actually found the existence of apes and the existence of monkeys at that time as a separate species. So what science is telling them is, no, not everything. SubhanAllah, yesterday, a few days ago, I read an article about certain types of frogs, sugarcane frogs, in Australia. The British colonials, when they went to Australia and they grew sugarcane there, they decided that in order to keep sugarcane safe from insects, they need to get something to stop it, to stop the insects that feed on sugarcane. So they got this type of frogs that feeds on insects, and they released them. These frogs started to multiply in huge numbers. There is some kind of billions of them in Australia. And they developed a specific poison in their skin. So their skin is poisonous. That now they are suffering from that as a plague. These frogs are everywhere. And when they release animals to eat them, the animals get poisoned, they die. So they discovered recently a big heap of them in a river, of these frogs, dead. But they noticed that they have been cut in a way that only their liver and their heart have been extracted. And these are the only two bodily parts that do not have any poison. The way their bodies have been cut is done in such a surgical way that only surgeons can do it. You know who's doing that? Rats. My wife said, rats are very intelligent. Mice are very intelligent. So look at that wonder of creation. That this is something, a species that's much less than human beings in intelligence, and yet it can actually cut a frog and eat these bodily parts. They said that it's even in certain parts, they remove the skin and they eat the flesh underneath it. They say only a surgeon can do that. Right? So is inspiration the route to knowledge? No. If that was the case, all human beings would have been inspired. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would have put in the minds of everyone that there is one God. Then is narration the route to it? That's another question. Can we just know by narration? I mean, if someone comes to us and says, well, there is one God, can we just know that there is one God by someone telling us? No. Why? Because if you don't know Allah, how would you know that this person that's coming to you is bringing that narration from him? In other words, how can you believe a prophet unless you believe in a God that has sent him? Then the last thing is imitation the route to it? That's also no. Why is it not? Because were we to know things through imitation, that if Allah was to tell us, you will know me by imitating somebody else, then we could have imitated anyone, isn't it? We would have imitated anyone. It follows that we should be able to imitate anyone and reach the same type of knowledge. But people who tell us things, they normally tell us contradicting things. And it's impossible to imitate everyone because these opinions are opposite to one another. Right? Therefore, the only means of knowledge is nazar. You have to have a form of nazar. You have to have evidence. So, the question is, doesn't saying an imitator is not a believer lead to expelling the majority of lay people from the fold of Islam? The answer is, the evidence required here, we need to understand that, the evidence required here is the general evidence that brings about clarity. Is the general evidence that brings about clarity. We do not need to know the theological proofs that the ulama of theology have. We don't need to know how to respond to misconceptions. So we have two types of evidence. One is what we call general evidence. Just conceptualizing the doctrinal belief in your mind. Just conceptualize something as simple as creation, creator creates creation. You don't need to go into details. You don't need to respond to misconceptions. And you don't even need to explain it to somebody else. There is a very interesting truth story about Imam. No, I'll keep that to later. As for the detailed evidence is one that is normally required and kept for the specialists. It's not required from the common folks. It's one that contains responses to misconceptions. They say that Imam al-Razi was walking with a group of his students and they passed by an old woman. So that old woman said, "Who is this man that is followed by these people?" They said, "This is al-Razi. He knows 130 proofs to the existence of God." She said, "If he knows 130 proofs, he must have 130 doubts." Right? I don't need to know all of this. And Imam al-Razi, when he was told about that, he actually praised the woman. And he said, "I wish I can die on the iman of this woman." Right? So when we say that the person needs to avoid imitation, we mean by that the person at least faith has to make sense to you. If it doesn't make sense to you, then you don't have faith. Right? And we stop here inshallah ta'ala. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah.